Millionaire CEO offers reward for his 100,000 lost suitcase. The honest woman's only request left him shocked. Hello, viewer. Thanks for joining us. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. The 42nd floor of the Callahan Technologies building hummed with the quiet efficiency of serious money being made. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of Manhattan's skyline. But Maxwell Callahan rarely looked up from his screens long enough to appreciate it. 3 monitors displayed real-time stock prices, quarterly projections, and acquisition targets. His world was measured in numbers, and the numbers were always good. "Mr. Callahan, your car is here for the airport." His assistant, Jennifer's voice, came through the intercom with practiced professionalism. Maxwell's fingers paused over the keyboard. The Portland meeting. Right. Some small tech company in Maine that had developed an interesting algorithm, probably worth acquiring if the price was reasonable. Everything had a price. 2 minutes, he replied, saving his work and shutting down the monitors with mechanical precision. The mahogany desk that had belonged to his father gleamed under the overhead lights. Maxwell grabbed his suit jacket from the leather chair and reached for the small black suitcase beside his desk. It was always with him on business trips. Not because it contained anything related to work, but because it held the only things that still mattered to him personally. Sarah's diary, the one she'd kept during her final months, and the envelope of photographs from their last vacation together in Tuscany, when she was still healthy enough to laugh at his terrible Italian pronunciation and insist they take pictures at every vineyard they visited. He'd carried the suitcase on every business trip for 5 years now. A private ritual, a way of keeping her close while he moved through a world that had become colorless after her death. The elevator descended silently to the parking garage where his driver waited beside the black sedan. Manhattan traffic was its usual nightmare, but Maxwell barely noticed. He reviewed notes on his tablet, preparing for the meeting with the small company that thought their little algorithm was worth 8 figures. At JFK, the private jet was fueled and ready. Maxwell settled into the leather seat and opened his laptop. The flight to Portland would take 90 minutes. Enough time to review the acquisition documents and prepare his opening offer. He always started low. Most people eventually took whatever he offered. "Ready for takeoff, Mr. Callahan?" The pilot's voice carried back from the cockpit. "Ready." The jet lifted off smoothly, banking north toward Maine. Maxwell worked steadily, occasionally glancing out at the patchwork of cities and forests passing below. Sarah had loved flying. She'd always chosen the window seat, pointing out landmarks and making up stories about the people in the houses they passed over. He closed his laptop and leaned back. Sometimes the memories caught him like this, unexpected and sharp. 5 years should have been enough time to dull the edges, but grief had its own timeline. The plane touched down at Portland International just after 2 o'clock. A rental car waited at the terminal, GPS already programmed for the address in the industrial district where Quantum Solutions rented a small office space. Maxwell had done his research. The company consisted of 3 MIT graduates who'd burned through their startup capital and were now desperate enough to consider his offer. The meeting went exactly as expected. The 3 young men, Maxwell couldn't bring himself to think of anyone under 30 as truly adult, presented their algorithm with nervous enthusiasm. It was actually quite impressive. A new approach to data compression that could revolutionize cloud storage, worth more than they realized, but not as much as they hoped. "We're looking for a partnership," the lead developer said. His name was something with too many syllables that Maxwell hadn't bothered to remember. "Someone who understands the technology and wants to help us grow." Maxwell smiled, the smile that had closed 1,000 deals. I understand the technology better than you might think, and I understand the market even better. Here's what I'm prepared to offer." He slid the contract across the table. The number at the bottom made all three men blink. "This is for complete acquisition," the young man said slowly. "As we were hoping to maintain some control." "Control is expensive," Maxwell interrupted. "This offer gives you enough money to start over with your next idea, or retire to a beach somewhere. Your choice." The meeting dragged on for another hour, but Maxwell knew he'd won the moment they saw the number. Everyone had a price, even idealistic MIT graduates with dreams of changing the world. By 6 o'clock, the preliminary agreement was signed. Maxwell shook hands with his new employees. He never thought of acquisitions as partnerships and walked back to his rental car. The small suitcase sat on the passenger seat where he'd left it. He never let it out of his sight during business meetings. The drive back to the airport should have taken 20 minutes. But Portland's evening traffic was heavier than expected, and construction on the interstate added another delay. Maxwell drummed his fingers on the steering wheel and checked his watch. He'd already called ahead to have the plane prepared for departure. At the airport, he returned the rental car and walked quickly toward the private aviation terminal. His phone buzzed with emails from Jennifer about tomorrow's schedule: a board meeting at 9, lunch with potential investors, a conference call with the London office. The usual choreography of high-stakes business. He was reviewing quarterly reports on his tablet when the announcement echoed through the terminal. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to severe weather moving into the New York area, all flights to metropolitan airports are temporarily suspended. We apologize for the inconvenience and will provide updates as conditions improve." Maxwell looked up from his screen. Through the terminal windows, the sky was clear. But weather in Maine meant nothing if storms were hitting New York. He called his pilot. "How long?" he asked when Mike answered. "Could be a few hours, Mr. Callahan, maybe longer. This system's moving slowly, and JFK is showing zero visibility right now." Maxwell closed his eyes and felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came with losing control of a situation. He hated delays, hated the helpless feeling of being stuck somewhere he didn't want to be. "I'll be in the lounge," he said. The private aviation lounge was comfortable enough, with leather chairs and complimentary food that pretended to be gourmet. Maxwell found a quiet corner and tried to work, but concentration eluded him. Other stranded passengers talked quietly or stared at their phones. The weather reports on the television showed an angry red mass of storms crawling across the northeast. 3 hours passed, then 4. Maxwell's frustration grew with each delayed departure announcement. He called Jennifer twice to reschedule tomorrow's meetings, then gave up and told her to clear his entire morning. "Should I book you a hotel room in Portland?" she asked. "No, this storm will clear eventually." But it didn't. By 11 o'clock, the terminal was nearly empty except for a handful of other stranded passengers and the cleaning crew. Maxwell had exhausted his patience and most of his phone battery. The storms were expected to continue through the night. He gathered his things and walked toward the exit, thinking about hotels and rental cars and the general inconvenience of weather that couldn't be bought or negotiated with. His laptop bag hung from his shoulder, his suit jacket draped over his arm. It wasn't until he was halfway to the taxi stand that he realized something was wrong. The suitcase. The small black suitcase that had been beside his chair in the lounge. Maxwell stopped walking so abruptly that a woman behind him nearly collided with him. He turned and half ran back toward the terminal, his chest tight with a panic he hadn't felt since the night Sarah died. The lounge was empty except for the cleaning crew. Maxwell searched every chair, every table, every corner where the suitcase might have been forgotten or moved. Nothing. "Excuse me," he called to a janitor emptying trash cans. There was a black suitcase near the chairs by the window. Small carry-on size. Did you see anyone take it? The man shook his head. Sorry, sir. Been cleaning for an hour now. Haven't seen any luggage left behind. Maxwell's hands shook as he pulled out his phone and called airport security. A bored-sounding officer took his information and promised to check the lost and found in the morning. In the morning. As if Sarah's diary and their last photographs together could wait until morning. He spent the next 2 hours retracing every step, talking to everyone who might have seen anything, the desk clerks, the food service workers, the other stranded passengers who were still waiting. No one remembered seeing his suitcase. No one had noticed anyone carrying something that didn't belong to them. By 2 in the morning, Maxwell sat alone in the empty lounge, staring at the chair where he'd left the most important things in his life. The storm outside had finally passed, but it was too late. The suitcase was gone, and with it, the last tangible pieces of Sarah. For the first time since her funeral, Maxwell Callahan put his head in his hands and wept. The Millport Public Library occupied a converted Victorian house on Elm Street, 3 blocks from the harbour where lobster boats bobbed at their morning moorings. Nancy Maeve had unlocked the front door at 8 o'clock sharp every weekday for the past 6 years, and she still felt a small thrill of satisfaction when she turned on the lights and watched the reading rooms come to life. This wasn't the kind of library that impressed anyone. No soaring ceilings or marble columns, just cozy rooms filled with well-worn books and mismatched furniture donated by locals over the decades. But it was hers in every way that mattered, and she loved it fiercely. Morning, Nancy. Eleanor Patterson shuffled through the front door at 8:15, same as always. Mrs. Patterson was 83 and had been checking out romance novels twice a week since Nancy started working here. Good morning, Mrs. Patterson. I put aside the new Debbie Macumber for you. You're an angel, dear. Did you have a good weekend? Nancy smiled as she handed over the book. Mrs. Patterson asked the same question every Monday, and Nancy always gave the same answer. Quiet and peaceful, just how I like it. Which was true, mostly. Her weekends were spent reading, tending her small garden, and visiting her grandmother at Sunset Manor. At 30, Nancy's life was exactly what most people would call boring, and she was perfectly content with that. She'd seen enough chaos and heartbreak in her childhood to appreciate the value of steady routines and predictable days. The morning passed quietly. A few regulars came in for newspapers or to use the computers. Nancy processed returned books and updated the catalogue system. Just before 10, she walked to the back room to make coffee and noticed the black suitcase sitting beside the employee entrance. It was the kind of expensive-looking luggage that didn't belong in Millport, leather, with brass fittings and a combination lock. Someone had left it leaning against the door sometime during the night or early morning. Nancy carried it to the front desk and examined it for identification tags. Nothing visible on the outside, but the lock was simple enough that she could probably figure out the combination if she needed to. She was still studying the suitcase when the phone rang. Millport Public Library. This is Nancy. Oh, thank God someone answered. The man's voice was tight with strain and exhaustion. I'm calling about a lost suitcase. Black leather, small carry-on size. I lost it at the Portland airport last night, and I thought maybe someone turned it in to local businesses. Nancy looked down at the suitcase beside her desk. Can you describe it in more detail? Expensive leather, brass combination lock, about 2 feet by 14 inches. There's a small scratch on the top corner from when my wife dropped it, getting out of a taxi in Rome. Nancy ran her finger along the top of the suitcase and found the scratch he'd described. What's your name, sir? Maxwell Callahan. I was stranded at the airport overnight because of the storms. When I went back to get my suitcase this morning, It was gone. This might sound crazy, but that suitcase contains some very personal items, irreplaceable items. I'm prepared to offer a substantial reward. Nancy could hear the desperation in his voice, barely controlled. Whatever was in this suitcase mattered to him more than money. Mr. Callahan, I think I have your suitcase. Someone left it by the back door of the Millport Public Library. I'm the librarian here. The silence on the other end lasted so long that Nancy wondered if the connection had been lost. You have it? His voice cracked slightly. You actually have it? I believe so. Based on your description, it matches perfectly. Would you like to come pick it up, or should I call the police to return it? No police. Please. I'll come get it myself. Where exactly are you? Nancy gave him the address and directions from Portland. It's about an hour drive south along the coast. I'll be here until 5 o'clock. I'm leaving now, and I'm sorry, what's your name? Nancy Maeve. Miss Maeve, I can't thank you enough. I'll bring a reward check with me. How does $5,000 sound? Nancy blinked. $5,000 for returning a lost suitcase. Whatever was inside must be incredibly valuable. That's very generous, but not necessary. I'm just glad I could help. Nonsense. You're saving my life here. $5,000 is the least I can do. After he hung up, Nancy sat staring at the suitcase and wondering what could be worth so much to someone. Jewelry, important documents. She was tempted to try opening it, but that felt like a violation of privacy. Instead, she moved it to her office and went back to work. The morning dragged by slowly. Nancy found herself checking the parking lot every few minutes, watching for an expensive car that would signal Maxwell Callahan's arrival. She'd looked him up online after their phone call and found dozens of articles about his business success. Pictures showed a handsome man in his late 30s with dark hair and serious eyes, worth several $100 million according to the financial magazines. What was someone like that doing in Maine? And how had his suitcase ended up behind the Millport Library? Just after noon, a black sedan pulled into the small parking lot behind the building. Nancy watched through her office window as a man got out, straightening his suit jacket and looking around with the expression of someone who'd never been in a town this small before. Maxwell Callahan was taller than his photos suggested and more tired-looking. His dark hair was disheveled, and there were shadows under his eyes that spoke of a sleepless night. He moved with the controlled energy of someone accustomed to being in charge, but there was something vulnerable in his expression as he approached the library's front door. Nancy met him at the entrance. "Mr. Callahan!" "Miss Maeve, thank you so much for calling." His handshake was firm but brief, and his eyes immediately searched the room. "Is it really here?" "My suitcase? It's in my office. Would you like to verify that it's yours before I give it to you?" She led him back to her small office, where the black suitcase sat on the chair beside her desk. Maxwell's entire body seemed to relax when he saw it. "That's it. That's definitely it." He reached for the combination lock with trembling fingers, turned the dials, and opened the case. Nancy tried not to look, but she couldn't help seeing what was inside. A leather-bound journal, an envelope of photographs, and a few other small personal items, nothing that looked particularly valuable, certainly nothing worth $5,000. Maxwell lifted the journal with the careful reverence of someone handling a holy relic. He opened it briefly, his eyes scanning a page of handwritten text, then closed it and held it against his chest. "My wife's diary," he said quietly. "She died 5 years ago. This is from her final months." He looked up at Nancy with eyes that were bright with unshed tears. "I thought I'd lost her all over again." Nancy felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. "I'm so sorry for your loss." Maxwell nodded and carefully placed the journal back in the suitcase, then reached into his jacket pocket. I brought you a check, as promised. $5,000. Mr. Callahan, I appreciate the gesture, but I can't accept that. I was just doing what anyone would do. Please, this means more to me than you can possibly understand. Nancy shook her head. It wouldn't feel right taking money for returning something that belongs to you. But there is something else you could do for me if you're willing. Maxwell's expression shifted to surprise. What do you mean? Nancy hesitated, wondering if she was about to make a fool of herself. But something about this man's grief reminded her of her own recent loss, and the words came out before she could stop them. My grandmother passed away 3 months ago. She was 91, and she'd been the most important person in my life since I was 7 years old. Before she died, she made me promise to do something for her. Maxwell waited, his attention completely focused on her in a way that made Nancy feel suddenly self-conscious. My grandmother kept all the letters my grandfather wrote to her during World War II and their early marriage. Over 300 letters, spanning almost 60 years. Her last wish was for someone to visit all the places they wrote about, the places that were special to them as a couple. She wanted their love story to be honored, even though they're both gone now. Nancy paused, feeling foolish. This wealthy businessman probably thought she was insane. The thing is, I can't afford to take that kind of time off work, and I definitely can't afford the travel expenses. Some of these places are across the country, but you asked what you could do for me, and that's it. That's what would mean more to me than any amount of money. Maxwell stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Nancy began to regret saying anything at all. You want me to fund a trip based on your grandparents' love letters, he said finally. Not fund it, take it, with me. My grandmother specifically wanted someone to visit these places and understand why they mattered. She said it couldn't just be about the money. It had to be about understanding love that lasts, real love, the kind that survives separation and hardship and time. Nancy felt her cheeks burning. I know it sounds ridiculous. A successful businessman like you has much more important things to do than chase around the country looking at places that mattered to 2 people you never met. I just thought, when would we leave? Maxwell interrupted. Nancy blinked. What? When would we need to leave? How long would this take? You're actually considering it. Maxwell looked down at the suitcase in his hands, then back at Nancy. Miss Maeve, you just gave me back the only things I have left of my wife. If visiting some old places with a stranger is what you want in return, then that's what we'll do. When do we start? Nancy felt her heart racing. She'd expected polite refusal, maybe a larger monetary offer. She hadn't expected agreement. I'd need a few days to arrange time off from work and make copies of the letters for our route. Maybe by the end of the week. Fine. Give me your contact information. I'll make arrangements for transportation and accommodations. Mr. Callahan, are you sure about this? I mean, you don't even know me, and this could take 2 weeks or more, depending on how many stops we make. Maxwell closed the suitcase with a decisive snap. Miss Maeve, I've spent the last 5 years building walls around everything that matters to me. Last night, when I thought I'd lost Sarah's diary, I realized those walls haven't protected me from anything. They've just made me smaller. He looked around the cozy library with its mismatched furniture and hand-lettered signs. Maybe it's time I remembered what the world looks like outside a boardroom. Nancy felt a flutter of excitement mixed with terror. She'd just committed to spending 2 weeks traveling with a complete stranger. A wealthy, grieving stranger who'd agreed to her ridiculous request without even asking sensible questions, like how much it would cost or where exactly they'd be going. I'll call you Thursday evening with the details, she said, pulling a business card from her desk drawer. That should give me time to sort through the letters and plan a route. Maxwell took the card and handed her one of his own. expensive cardstock with raised lettering. I'll have my assistant book flights and hotels, first-class accommodations, obviously. Oh, you don't need to, Miss Maeve. If we're going to do this, we're going to do it properly. I may not understand why your grandmother's love story matters, but I understand the value of keeping promises. After he left, Nancy sat in her office holding his business card and wondering what she'd just gotten herself into. Through the window, she watched the black sedan disappear down Elm Street, heading back toward whatever complicated life Maxwell Callahan lived in New York. She pulled out her phone and called Sunset Manor. "Hi, Mrs. Chen. It's Nancy Maeve. I need to speak with the activities director about my grandmother's personal effects, specifically her letter collection. I think it's time to fulfill that promise I made." The elevator to Maxwell's office climbed silently toward the 42nd floor while he stood with the recovered suitcase pressed against his side like a talisman. Jennifer had texted him 6 times during the drive from Maine, each message more urgent than the last. The board meeting had been postponed twice. 3 potential investors were threatening to walk away from a deal that had taken months to negotiate. His London office was in crisis over a regulatory issue that required his immediate attention. Maxwell read through the messages without feeling his usual spike of adrenaline. The crises that had seemed critical yesterday now felt strangely distant, as if he were viewing them through the wrong end of a telescope. "Mr. Callahan, thank God you're back." Jennifer practically leaped from her desk when the elevator doors opened. "The board is furious about the meeting delay, and Mr. Hendricks from Goldman called 4 times. He says if we don't return his call by close of business today, reschedule everything for next week," Maxwell said, walking past her toward his office. Jennifer hurried after him, her heels clicking on the marble floor. "Everything? But the investor meeting is tomorrow, and the regulatory deadline." "Next week, Jennifer." "All of it." Maxwell set the suitcase on his desk and turned to face his assistant. "I need you to book travel arrangements. 2 people, departing Friday. I'll have the itinerary for you by tomorrow evening." Jennifer's mouth opened and closed without sound. In 12 years of working for Maxwell Callahan, she'd never seen him postpone anything. He was the man who'd flown to Tokyo with pneumonia rather than miss a crucial negotiation. "Sir, I don't understand." "Where are you going? For how long?" Maxwell sat heavily in his leather chair and looked out at the Manhattan skyline. From this height, people on the sidewalks looked like ants, their individual struggles invisible and insignificant. He'd spent years in this office making decisions that affected thousands of lives, moving millions of dollars with keystrokes and phone calls. But sitting in a small-town library that morning, listening to Nancy Maeve talk about her grandmother's letters, he'd felt more connected to something real than he had in 5 years. "I'm taking a trip with someone who reminded me what I've forgotten," he said finally. Jennifer waited for more explanation, but Maxwell had turned back to his computer screens and was already lost in thought. She retreated to her desk, shaking her head and wondering if her boss had suffered some kind of breakdown. Maxwell spent the rest of the afternoon making calls, systematically cancelling or postponing every commitment on his calendar for the next 3 weeks. Some people were understanding. Others were furious. A few threatened to take their business elsewhere. "Let them," Maxwell said, when Jennifer warned him about a particularly important client's reaction. "But if their loyalty depends on my being available every moment of every day, then we don't have the kind of relationship I want anyway." By evening, Maxwell's calendar was clear for the first time since Sarah's death. He sat alone in his office as the sun set over Manhattan, thinking about Nancy Maeve's grandmother and the 300 letters that chronicled a lifetime of love. Sarah would have understood. She'd always said Maxwell worked too much, cared too much about deals and acquisitions and numbers that changed every day. She'd wanted to travel more, see more of the country beyond the cities where his business took him. "There's a whole world out there that doesn't revolve around quarterly profits," she'd told him once. "Don't you want to see it?" He'd promised they'd take that trip after the next big acquisition closed, after the IPO launched, after the market stabilized, always after, and then Sarah got sick, and there was no more after. Maxwell opened the small suitcase and carefully lifted out his wife's diary. The leather cover was worn soft from handling, and several pages had bookmarks where she'd marked passages that were particularly important to her. He opened to a random page and read her careful handwriting. "Maxwell is working late again tonight. I know the Singapore deal is important, but I wish he could see that time is the one thing we can't buy more of. I love him for his ambition, but I worry he's going to wake up someday and realize he spent all his energy acquiring things that don't love him back. I found some letters in Mom's attic today, notes Daddy wrote to her during the war, 50 years old, and they still made me cry. Real love leaves traces, doesn't it? It echoes through time in ways that stock portfolios and bank accounts never will. I hope Maxwell and I leave that kind of echo." Maxwell closed the diary with trembling hands. Sarah had been right about everything, as usual. He'd spent 5 years since her death, accumulating more wealth, more success, more of everything except what actually mattered. And now a stranger in a small Maine town was offering him the chance to understand what his wife had been trying to tell him. He picked up his phone and dialed Nancy Maeve's number. "Hello!" Her voice was warm and slightly breathless, as if she'd been rushing to answer. "Miss Maeve, it's Maxwell Callahan. I've cleared my schedule for the next 3 weeks. How many stops are we planning to make?" Nancy set down her phone and stared at the pile of yellowed envelopes spread across her kitchen table. 312 letters, to be exact. She'd spent the last 2 days organizing them chronologically and mapping out the locations mentioned in her grandparents' correspondence. 3 weeks, she murmured to herself. Maxwell Callahan had cleared 3 weeks of his schedule for a complete stranger's request. The magnitude of that commitment was both thrilling and terrifying. She picked up the first letter in the sequence, dated June 15th, 1943. Her grandfather's handwriting was careful and deliberate, each word chosen with the precision of someone who knew paper and ink were precious during wartime. "My dearest Rose, I'm writing this from a train station in Chicago, thinking about that afternoon we spent at Lincoln Park Zoo before I shipped out. Do you remember how we laughed when that monkey stole your hat? I carry that memory like a talisman. When this war is over, I want to take you back there and buy you ice cream from that vendor near the elephant enclosure. I want to make 1,000 more memories in places that will always belong to us." Nancy felt the familiar tightness in her throat that came with reading her grandparents' words. Grandmother Rose had shared some of these letters before, but reading them now, with the knowledge that she'd soon be visiting these places, made them feel different, more urgent, more precious. Her phone buzzed with a text from Maxwell. "My assistant will contact you tomorrow about flight details. Are you having second thoughts?" Nancy typed back quickly. "No second thoughts, just overwhelmed by how many places they wrote about. This is going to be quite a journey. The best journeys usually are," came his reply. Friday morning arrived grey and drizzly, with fog rolling in from the Atlantic to shroud Millport in its familiar embrace. Nancy stood at her bedroom window, watching fishing boats disappear into the mist, and wondered if she was making the biggest mistake of her life. Her suitcase sat open on the bed, half packed with clothes that seemed inadequate for a cross-country trip with a millionaire. What did one wear to retrace a love story? What was the appropriate outfit for explaining to a stranger why her grandparents' romance mattered enough to justify 3 weeks away from real life? The doorbell rang at exactly 8 o'clock. Nancy grabbed her purse and suitcase and opened the front door to find Maxwell Callahan standing on her porch, looking polished and professional in a charcoal suit despite the early hour. Good morning, Miss Maeve. Ready for our adventure? Nancy noticed that he carried the same black suitcase from the library, and something about that detail made her feel less nervous. He understood about keeping important things close. "I'm as ready as I'll ever be," she said, locking the door behind her. The ride to Portland Airport passed quietly, both of them seemingly lost in their own thoughts. Nancy clutched a leather portfolio containing copies of all the letters, organized by location and date. Maxwell made calls to his office, speaking in the clipped, efficient language of someone accustomed to making million-dollar decisions before most people had finished their morning coffee. At the airport, Nancy experienced her first taste of how the wealthy traveled. No security lines, no crowded gates. They were escorted to a private terminal where a sleek jet waited on the tarmac. "Is this your plane?" Nancy asked as they climbed the stairs. One of them. It seemed more practical than commercial flights, given our itinerary. The interior was all cream leather and polished wood, with seats that looked more like living room furniture than airline seating. Nancy settled into a chair by the window and tried not to calculate how much this level of luxury must cost. "So," Maxwell said once they were airborne, "where exactly are we going first?" Nancy opened her portfolio and pulled out the earliest letter. "Chicago, the train station where my grandfather wrote his first letter, and Lincoln Park Zoo, where they had their last date before he shipped out for Europe." Maxwell nodded. "My assistant booked us at the Palmer House." "I hope that's acceptable. I'm sure it's lovely. You really didn't need to go to such expense." "Miss Maeve." Maxwell's voice was gentle but firm. "You gave me back something irreplaceable. Let me do this properly." Nancy looked out at the clouds passing below and tried to process the surreal turn her life had taken. 3 days ago, she'd been a small-town librarian whose biggest decision was which books to feature in the monthly display. Now she was flying in a private jet with one of the richest men in America, embarking on a journey that would take them across the country in pursuit of her grandparents' love story. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course. Why did you really agree to this? I mean, you could have just written me a check for whatever this trip costs and been done with it. Why take 3 weeks out of your life for people you never met?" Maxwell was quiet for so long that Nancy began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than she'd heard it before. "My wife used to say I lived my entire life in the future tense, always planning the next acquisition, the next deal, the next milestone. She wanted us to travel together, see the places that weren't connected to business. I kept promising we'd do it someday." He looked out the window. "Someday never came. When she got sick, all we had were the places we'd talked about visiting but never seen." Nancy felt her heart contract with sympathy. "I'm sorry. Your grandmother was 91 when she died. She had 60 years of shared memories with your grandfather. They created a whole geography of love, places that belonged to them, experiences that defined their relationship. That's something I never gave Sarah and myself." Nancy understood then. This wasn't really about her grandparents' love story. It was about Maxwell's regrets, and maybe his hope that understanding someone else's successful love might teach him something about his own loss. "The letters will show you what real love looks like," she said quietly, "if you're ready to see it." Maxwell met her eyes. "I think that's exactly what I need to learn." Chicago's Union Station bustled with the same energy it had possessed in 1943, though the soldiers were gone, and the urgency was different now. Nancy and Maxwell stood on the platform where her grandfather had written his first wartime letter, watching modern travelers hurry toward their own destinations. "He was 22, Nancy said, reading from the letter in her hands. "Just a kid, really. But listen to this part. I know we've only been married 6 months, but I feel like I've loved you my whole life. Every mile this train carries me away from you is a mile. I'll have to travel back to get home to where I belong." Maxwell listened intently, his expression thoughtful. How long were they apart? 18 months. He served in France and Germany, and she worked in a munitions factory in Detroit while he was gone. They wrote to each other almost every day. They walked through the station slowly, Nancy sharing excerpts from the early letters while Maxwell absorbed the words with the focused attention he usually reserved for merger documents. There was something different about him here, Nancy noticed. The sharp edges of his business persona seemed softer in this place where thousands of love stories had begun and ended. "The zoo is next," Nancy said as they emerged into the Chicago afternoon. That's where they had their last date before he shipped out. Lincoln Park Zoo was crowded with families and school groups, the sounds of children's laughter mixing with animal calls. Nancy and Maxwell found the elephant enclosure mentioned in the letter, though the old ice cream vendor had long since been replaced by modern concession stands. "Oh, there," Nancy pointed to a bench near the elephant habitat. "That's probably where they sat when that monkey stole grandmother's hat." Maxwell smiled, the first genuinely relaxed expression Nancy had seen from him. "Did your grandfather ever tell that story?" "Thousands of times. Every anniversary, every birthday, every time we visited the zoo when I was little. He'd point to that exact spot and say, 'That's where I knew I was going to marry your grandmother,' when she laughed instead of getting mad about her hat." They sat on the bench and watched families pose for photos with the elephants in the background. Nancy pulled out another letter, dated 2 weeks after the zoo visit. This one he wrote from Camp Pendleton before shipping out. "Rose, I keep thinking about how you looked when you laughed at that monkey. Pure joy, like nothing in the world could touch you. I'm going to carry that picture of you in my mind through whatever comes next. And when I get home, I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure you have reasons to laugh like that every day." Maxwell was quiet for a long moment. He kept that promise. Every single day for 60 years, even when grandfather was dying, he was still trying to make her laugh. She said the last thing he did was tell her a terrible joke about a monkey and an elephant. "Your grandmother must have been extraordinary." Nancy smiled. She was. But I think the extraordinary thing was how they chose to love each other. It wasn't just the big romantic gestures. It was the daily decision to keep choosing each other, even when things got difficult. Maxwell thought about Sarah, about how their relationship had been consumed by the urgency of building his business empire. They'd loved each other desperately, but had they chosen each other daily? Had he made her laugh enough? Had he given her enough reasons to feel joy? "The next stop is Detroit," Nancy said, consulting her itinerary. "That's where my grandmother worked while he was overseas. She wrote to him from a boarding house near the factory." "How many cities are we visiting?" 12, if we follow their complete story. Chicago, Detroit, then smaller towns where they lived during different periods of their marriage. The last stop is Bar Harbor, Maine, where they honeymooned and where they celebrated their 60th anniversary 6 months before he died. Maxwell nodded. "Then that's where we'll go?" Detroit had changed dramatically since Rose Maeve worked in the Willow Run bomber plant, but traces of the old industrial neighborhood remained. Nancy and Maxwell walked past abandoned factories and revitalized lofts, reading letters that described a young woman's determination to support the war effort while missing her husband desperately. "She lived here," Nancy said, stopping in front of a narrow brick building that had been converted to artist studios. Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, 23 women, all with husbands or boyfriends overseas. Maxwell examined the building, trying to imagine it as it had been 70 years earlier. What did she write about this place? Nancy found the relevant letter. "This is from October 1943. James, the work is hard and the hours are long, but I'm proud to be doing my part. Mrs. Henderson makes us say grace before dinner and tell one good thing that happened that day. Last night I said my good thing was getting your letter. Tonight it will be the same thing, and tomorrow night too, if the mailman is kind to me." They stood outside the building, both imagining a young woman bent over a letter at a small desk, pouring her heart onto paper that would travel thousands of miles to reach the man she loved. She was stronger than she knew, Maxwell observed. She had to be, but look at this. Nancy flipped to another letter. Under this one, she wrote after getting news that his unit had been in heavy fighting. "I won't pretend I'm not scared, James. I wake up every morning afraid that today will be the day I get a telegram instead of a letter. But I refuse to live in fear. If something happens to you, I want you to know that these months of waiting have taught me something important. Love isn't diminished by distance or danger. It's only made stronger by the choice to keep loving despite the risk." Maxwell felt something shift in his chest as he listened to Rose's words. He'd spent 5 years protecting himself from the risk of loving again, convinced that the pain of loss was too high a price for the joy of connection. But this young woman had understood something he'd forgotten, that love's value wasn't diminished by its fragility. "Your grandmother was wise beyond her years," he said. Nancy smiled. "She used to tell me that war taught her generation not to waste time on small fears. When you're not sure if the person you love will come home alive, you don't have the luxury of holding back your feelings." They spent the afternoon walking through the neighborhood, reading letters that chronicled Rose's daily life during wartime. Her friendships with other women at the boarding house, her volunteer work at the USO, her determination to stay strong for James, even when the news from Europe was devastating. As evening approached, they found themselves at a small diner that might have existed during Rose's time in Detroit. The owner, an elderly woman with kind eyes, served them coffee and pie, while Nancy shared excerpts from the letters. "My grandmother lived through the Depression and World War II, Nancy explained to the woman. "She used to say that hard times don't break people, they reveal who people really are underneath." The diner owner nodded knowingly. "My parents' generation knew things we've forgotten, about sacrifice and commitment and what really matters." Maxwell thought about his own generation's approach to relationships. The endless options, the constant analysis, the fear of missing out on something better. His parents had been married for 47 years before his father died, but Maxwell had never really examined what held them together through decades of ordinary days. "Where to next?" he asked as they walked back to their hotel. "Kansas. A small town called Cedar Falls, where my grandfather was stationed briefly after the war ended, but before he came home. And then Iowa, where they lived for their first year of marriage." Maxwell nodded, surprised by how much he was looking forward to the next stop. For the first time in 5 years, he wasn't thinking about quarterly projections or acquisition strategies. He was thinking about a young couple who'd built a life together, one letter, one choice, one day at a time. "Nancy," he said, as they reached the hotel, "thank you for letting me be part of this." She looked at him with surprise. "Thank you for making it possible. I never could have done this alone." But as they rode the elevator to their respective floors, both of them were beginning to understand that this journey was becoming something neither of them had expected. It wasn't just about honoring the past anymore. It was about discovering what the future might hold. Cedar Falls, Kansas, was the kind of town that time had politely declined to change. Main Street still featured a barbershop with a spinning pole, a 5 and dime store, and a cafe where the pie was homemade and the coffee strong enough to wake the dead. Nancy and Maxwell drove their rental car slowly through streets that looked almost exactly as they had in 1946. According to the letter, Grandfather was stationed at the temporary demobilization center just outside town, Nancy said, consulting her map. He wrote to grandmother every day for 6 weeks while he waited for his discharge papers. They found the site where the center had been, now converted to a small industrial park. Nothing remained of the military buildings, but Nancy had brought a photograph that showed rows of temporary structures where thousands of soldiers had waited to return to civilian life. "This letter is from his second week here," Nancy said, sitting on the hood of their rental car. "Rose, I know I should be happy that the war is over and I'm finally coming home, but I'm scared. What if I don't remember how to be a husband? What if the war changed me too much? What if you look at me and see a stranger?" Maxwell was studying the photograph, trying to imagine the organized chaos of thousands of young men processing out of military service. "How did your grandmother respond to that?" Nancy flipped through her copies until she found Rose's reply. She wrote back, "James, of course the war changed you. It changed me too. We're not the same people who said goodbye at Union Station. But we're still the people who choose to love each other, and that's all we need to start building our life together. Smart woman. The smartest. But look at this next part. This is what I really wanted you to hear." Nancy cleared her throat and read, "I've been thinking about what kind of marriage I want us to have. Not the kind where we pretend nothing bad ever happened, or where we try to go back to being who we were before. I want the kind of marriage where we help each other become who we're meant to be next, where we're brave enough to keep growing together instead of just trying to hold on to what we used to have." Maxwell felt the words hit him like a physical blow. That was exactly what he'd been doing since Sarah died, trying to hold on to what they'd had instead of allowing himself to grow beyond it. He'd built a shrine to their relationship and locked himself inside it. "Your grandmother understood something most people never figure out," he said quietly. "What's that?" "That love isn't about preserving the past. It's about creating the future together." Nancy studied Maxwell's profile as he stared across the empty field. There was something different about him today. A softness that hadn't been there in Chicago or Detroit. The letters were affecting him in ways she hadn't anticipated. "The next stop is Iowa," she said. "And that's where they lived for their first year of marriage, a little farming town called Millerville. How did they end up there?" Nancy pulled out another letter. "Grandfather got a job teaching at the local high school while he figured out what he wanted to do with his life. They rented a tiny apartment above the pharmacy. Grandmother said it was the happiest year of their marriage because they had so little money that all they could afford to do was talk to each other." Maxwell laughed, a real laugh that transformed his entire face. "That's probably not a bad foundation for a marriage." "No, it's not. Want to hear about their first fight?" "Definitely." Nancy found the letter she was looking for. "This is from grandmother to her sister back in Detroit. Martha, James, and I had our first real argument last night. About money, of course. He wants to spend our savings on a used car so I don't have to walk to the grocery store. I want to save every penny for his college tuition. We both got so frustrated that we ended up shouting at each other, and then we both started laughing because we realized we were fighting about who got to sacrifice more for the other person." "How did they resolve it?" "They bought the car. Grandmother said she learned that sometimes love means letting the other person take care of you, even when you're perfectly capable of taking care of yourself." Maxwell thought about Sarah's frequent complaints that he never let her help with the business, never asked for her advice about important decisions. He'd thought he was protecting her from stress, but maybe he'd been protecting himself from vulnerability. "I think I'm beginning to understand why your grandmother wanted these places visited," he said. "She wanted someone to see how love actually works on a daily basis, not the greeting card version, but the real thing." Nancy felt a flutter of something she couldn't quite name. Maxwell wasn't just listening to her grandparents' story anymore. He was absorbing it, letting it change something inside him. And the way he looked at her when she read the letters was starting to make her feel things she had no business feeling about a man she'd known for less than a week. "We should probably get going," she said, sliding off the hood of the car. "Iowa is still 3 hours away." As they drove through the Kansas countryside, Nancy found herself stealing glances at Maxwell. The sharp-edged businessman from New York was gradually being replaced by someone more thoughtful, more present. The letters were working their magic on him, just as Grandmother Rose had somehow known they would. But Nancy was beginning to suspect that the magic was working on her too. Millerville, Iowa, population 847, welcome visitors with a hand-painted sign and a main street that looked like a movie set from the 1950s. Nancy and Maxwell checked into the town's only bed and breakfast, a Victorian house run by a woman named Agnes, who seemed to know the history of every building within a 50-mile radius. "The old pharmacy where your grandparents lived," Agnes said when Nancy explained their mission. "Oh, honey, that building's been gone for 20 years, but I can show you exactly where it was, and Mrs. Muller next door knew your grandmother. She's 93 now, but sharp as a tack." That evening, Agnes introduced them to Mrs. Muller, who invited them onto her porch for lemonade and stories about the young couple who'd lived above the pharmacy in 1946. "Rose was the prettiest thing you ever saw," Mrs. Muller recalled, her eyes bright with memory, "and so in love with that husband of hers. They'd walk down Main Street every evening, holding hands and talking like they were the only two people in the world." Nancy pulled out one of her grandmother's letters from that period. She wrote about those walks. "James and I have started a tradition. Every evening after dinner, we walk to the end of Main Street and back, and we tell each other about our day, not just the facts, but how things made us feel. What we worried about, what made us happy, what we dreamed about. By the time we get home, it's like we've lived through the day together instead of separately." Mrs. Muller nodded. They were always talking, those two. At the grocery store, at church, at the school events, never seemed to run out of things to say to each other. Maxwell thought about his own marriage, about how he and Sarah had often gone days communicating only about schedules and logistics. When had they stopped really talking to each other? "Did they seem happy?" Nancy asked. "Oh, child, they were the happiest poor people you ever saw. Didn't have 2 nickels to rub together, but they acted like they'd won the lottery every day." After Mrs. Muller went inside, Nancy and Maxwell walked down Main Street, following the route her grandparents had taken every evening. The storefronts had changed, but the basic layout of the town remained the same. "Can I ask you something personal?" Nancy said as they reached the end of the street. "Of course. What was your marriage like? With Sarah?" Maxwell was quiet for several steps. "Intense, passionate, but also frantic, I guess. We were both so focused on building the business, on reaching the next milestone. We loved each other desperately, but we were always rushing towards some future version of our lives that never quite arrived." Nancy nodded. "My grandparents were the opposite. They seemed to understand that the life they were living was the life they wanted, not just a stepping stone to something else. That's a rare gift, or a conscious choice." They walked back toward the bed and breakfast in comfortable silence, both lost in thought. At the front porch, Nancy hesitated. "And Maxwell, can I tell you something that might sound strange? After the week we've had, I don't think anything would sound strange." Nancy smiled. "I think my grandmother would have liked you. She always said the best people were the ones who were brave enough to keep learning about themselves, even when it was uncomfortable." Maxwell felt something warm unfold in his chest. "I think I would have liked her too." They stood on the porch for a moment, the Iowa evening settling around them with the sound of crickets and the distant hum of air conditioners. Nancy was acutely aware of how close Maxwell was standing, close enough that she could smell his cologne and see the tired lines around his eyes. "Where to tomorrow?" he asked softly. "Wisconsin, a lake where they spent their first anniversary, and then—" Nancy consulted her mental map. "Then we start heading toward the places that shaped the middle years of their marriage, when they had children and faced real challenges." Maxwell nodded. "I'm ready for whatever comes next." As Nancy climbed the stairs to her room, she realized that she was ready too, not just for the next stop on their journey, but for whatever was developing between her and this complicated man who was letting her grandparents' love story change him. She was falling for Maxwell Callahan, and she had no idea what to do about it. Lake Delton, Wisconsin, sparkled in the morning sunlight like a jewel set in emerald hills. Nancy and Maxwell stood on the dock where her grandparents had celebrated their first anniversary in 1947, reading the letter Rose had written to her sister about that weekend. "Martha, I finally understand what people mean when they talk about being perfectly happy. James rented a little cabin on the lake, and we've spent 3 days doing absolutely nothing except talking and fishing and watching the sunset. Last night he told me he'd never been happier in his life, and I realized I could say the same thing. Not because anything extraordinary happened, but because everything ordinary felt extraordinary when we did it together." Maxwell looked across the lake, imagining a young couple discovering that happiness didn't require grand gestures or expensive vacations. How long had they been married at that point? 1 year exactly. And listen to this part. Nancy flipped to another letter. "But this is what grandmother wrote to grandfather that weekend. I know we promised each other forever when we got married, but sitting here with you now, forever doesn't feel long enough. I want 1,000 lifetimes with you, James. I want to grow old and then figure out how to love each other in whatever comes after this life." Did your grandfather save her letters too? Every single one. After he died, we found them bundled together in his desk drawer, tied with the same ribbon she'd used on their wedding bouquet. Maxwell felt a sharp pang of loss. He'd kept some of Sarah's notes and cards, but nothing like this comprehensive chronicle of a shared life. Their relationship had been documented in business trips and public events, not in quiet letters that captured the dailiness of love. "I think I'm starting to understand what your grandmother wanted," he said. "What do you mean?" Maxwell was quiet for a moment, organizing his thoughts. She wanted someone to witness what they'd built together, not just the big moments, the wedding, the anniversaries, the births of children, but the small daily choices that made their love story real. Nancy felt her heart skip. That's exactly right. She used to say that love letters weren't about the words on the page. They were about the decision to keep writing them, even when life got complicated. They spent the afternoon exploring the small resort town, visiting the cabin where her grandparents had stayed and the restaurant where they'd shared anniversary dinners for the next 30 years. Nancy shared letters from multiple decades, showing how her grandparents had returned to this place again and again, creating a tradition that anchored their marriage through good times and difficult ones. "This is from their 10th anniversary, Nancy said, as they sat in the same restaurant booth her grandparents had always requested. "James, 10 years ago, I thought I knew what love was. I was so young and naive. Real love isn't the butterflies and excitement of early romance. It's the decision to keep choosing each other when the butterflies have settled into something deeper and more reliable. It's knowing that this person will show up for you, day after day, year after year, regardless of what life throws at you." Maxwell thought about his own understanding of love, how it had been shaped by intensity and passion rather than reliability and daily choice. Your grandparents were unusually wise, or maybe they just lived long enough to figure out what worked. Nancy hesitated, then decided to be brave. Can I ask you something? Always. Do you think you'll ever want to love someone again? After Sarah. The question hung between them like a bridge. Neither was sure they were ready to cross. Maxwell stared out at the lake, thinking about the walls he'd built around his heart and whether they were protecting him or imprisoning him. A week ago, I would have said no, he answered honestly. I thought loving Sarah was the only love story I was meant to have. But listening to your grandparents' letters, seeing how they kept growing together instead of just holding on to the past. He met Nancy's eyes. I'm beginning to think maybe I've been confusing grief with loyalty. Nancy felt something flutter in her chest. What do you mean? I mean, maybe honoring Sarah's memory doesn't require me to stop living. Maybe it requires me to live more fully, the way she always wanted me to. The conversation was interrupted by their waitress, an elderly woman who'd been working at the restaurant for 40 years and remembered serving Rose and James Maeve on multiple occasions. Such a sweet couple, she said when Nancy explained their connection, always held hands across the table, even when they were in their 80s, made you believe in true love, watching them together. After dinner, Maxwell and Nancy walked along the lakeshore, following the path her grandparents had taken on countless anniversary visits. The sun was setting over the water, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Nancy, Maxwell said, stopping suddenly. I need to tell you something. She turned to face him, her heart racing. What? This trip, spending these days with you, learning about your grandparents, it's changing me in ways I didn't expect, and I don't want you to think I'm taking advantage of your kindness or your grief. Nancy stepped closer to him. What are you trying to say? Maxwell took a deep breath. And I'm trying to say that I think I'm falling in love with you, and I don't know if that's okay or if it's too soon, or if you could possibly feel the same way about someone you met less than a week ago. Nancy felt the world shift around her. For 5 days, she'd been trying to ignore the growing attraction between them, telling herself it was just the romance of the letters and the intimacy of shared travel. But hearing Maxwell say the words out loud made her realize she'd been lying to herself. Maxwell, she said softly, reaching for his hand. I think I've been falling in love with you too. And I think my grandmother would say that love doesn't operate on anyone's timeline but its own. Maxwell squeezed her hand, feeling something he'd thought was lost forever. Hope for a future that held more than just memories. Are we crazy? He asked. Nancy smiled. Probably. But the good kind of crazy, the kind that leads to 60 years of love letters, as they kissed beside the lake where her grandparents had celebrated decades of anniversaries. Nancy felt her grandmother's presence like a blessing. Rose Maeve had sent them on this journey to honor the past, but she'd also given them permission to create their own future. The love story wasn't ending, it was just beginning. The morning after their first kiss, Nancy woke in her Wisconsin bed and breakfast room with the disorienting sensation that the world had shifted on its axis overnight. Sunlight streamed through lace curtains, and she could hear Maxwell moving around in the room next door, the familiar sounds of someone checking emails and making phone calls. But everything felt different now. The careful distance they'd maintained for 5 days had evaporated beside the lake, replaced by something electric and uncertain. Nancy stared at the ceiling and wondered how you were supposed to act the morning after you'd admitted to falling in love with someone you barely knew. A soft knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. Nancy, I've ordered breakfast downstairs, whenever you're ready. Maxwell's voice carried the same uncertainty she felt. They were venturing into uncharted territory now, and neither of them had a map. 20 minutes later, Nancy found him at a corner table in the bed and breakfast dining room, studying his phone with the intense focus she'd come to recognize as his default response to emotional complexity. "Good morning," she said, sliding into the chair across from him. Maxwell looked up and smiled, and Nancy felt her heart do something acrobatic in her chest. "Good morning. I hope you slept well." "Like a rock, you." "Not particularly." Maxwell set down his phone. "I spent most of the night wondering if I'd made a complete fool of myself by the lake." Nancy reached across the table and touched his hand. "You didn't. We didn't." Some of the tension left Maxwell's shoulders. "Good, because I have a confession to make." "What's that?" "I've never done this before. Fallen for someone while traveling across the country on what amounts to a spiritual quest. I'm not sure of the protocol." Nancy laughed. "I don't think there is a protocol, but I have an idea. I'm listening. We keep following my grandparents' letters. We finish what we started, and we see what happens between us along the way, without trying to force it or analyze it to death." Maxwell nodded slowly. "That sounds remarkably sensible for someone who kissed a virtual stranger beside a lake last night. Sometimes the most sensible thing is to trust your heart instead of your head." Their next stop was Minneapolis, where Rose and James had lived during the early years of their marriage, while James attended college on the GI Bill. Nancy read from letters that chronicled the challenges of young love, navigating financial stress, academic pressure, and the ordinary difficulties of learning to build a life together. "This letter is from 1949, Nancy said, as they walked across the University of Minnesota campus. "James is studying so hard for his engineering exams that I barely see him except when he falls asleep at the kitchen table over his textbooks. I know this degree is important for our future, but sometimes I feel like I'm married to his ambition instead of to him." Maxwell winced. That sounds familiar. But listen to how grandmother handled it. Nancy flipped to Rose's next letter. "I realize today that I have a choice. I can resent the time James spends studying, or I can find ways to support his dreams while still taking care of my own needs. So I've started bringing him coffee while he studies, and I use that time to read my own books. We're in the same room, working toward our separate goals, but we're doing it together." They spent the afternoon exploring the neighborhood where her grandparents had lived in a tiny apartment near campus. The buildings had been renovated, but the basic character of the area remained unchanged. Nancy shared letters that showed how Rose had found work as a seamstress while James completed his degree, how they'd made friends with other young couples facing similar struggles, how they'd learned to find joy in small pleasures when money was tight. "Your grandmother was remarkably mature for someone so young," Maxwell observed, as they sat in a coffee shop that might have existed during her grandparents' time. "She had to grow up fast. But I think the war taught her generation not to waste time on petty complaints. When you've been separated by an ocean and weren't sure you'd ever see each other again, arguing about who forgot to take out the trash seems pretty silly." Maxwell thought about his own tendency to let small irritations fester into larger conflicts. Sarah used to say I turned molehills into mountains when it came to household issues. "But you're not the same person you were 5 years ago. People can change." Maxwell met Nancy's eyes across the table. "Is that what you think is happening to me? That I'm changing? I think you're remembering who you used to be before grief made you forget." That evening, they had dinner at a restaurant overlooking the Mississippi River. Maxwell had been quieter than usual all day, and Nancy could sense him wrestling with something. "What's on your mind?" she asked finally. Maxwell set down his fork and looked at her seriously. "I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest." "Okay." Do you think what's happening between us is real, or are we just caught up in the romance of your grandparents' story? Nancy considered the question carefully. It was something she'd been wondering herself. I think the letters created the circumstances for us to really see each other, she said finally. But what I feel for you isn't about my grandparents. It's about the way you listen when I talk, and how you've let their story change you instead of just observing it from a distance. It's about how you make me feel like the most interesting person in the room, even when we're talking about people who died before you met me. Maxwell felt something tight in his chest loosen. And what do you feel for me? Nancy took a breath. And I feel like I've been waiting my whole life to meet you, and I didn't even know I was waiting. Maxwell reached across the table and took her hand. Nancy, I need you to know something. When Sarah died, I thought my capacity for love died with her. These past 5 years, I felt like I was just going through the motions of living. But being with you, learning about what your grandparents built together, it's like someone turned the lights back on. I know. I can see it in your face. But I'm scared, Maxwell continued, scared that I've forgotten how to be in a relationship. Scared that I'll hurt you the way I hurt Sarah by always putting work first. Scared that this is too good to be true. Nancy squeezed his hand. Maxwell, fear is just evidence that what we're feeling matters. If it didn't matter, we wouldn't be scared of losing it. The next morning brought the first real test of their newfound relationship. Maxwell's phone rang at 6 a.m. with a call from his assistant Jennifer, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. Mr. Callahan, I'm sorry to bother you, but we have a situation. The Singapore deal is falling apart. The investors are threatening to pull out unless you're in New York for a meeting tomorrow morning. And the SEC has questions about the Quantum Solutions acquisition that require your immediate attention. Nancy watched Maxwell's face change as he listened, saw the businessman reassert himself over the man who'd been falling in love beside a Minnesota river. How bad is it? Maxwell asked. Bad. We could lose $40 million if this Singapore deal collapses. And the SEC investigation could delay the quantum acquisition indefinitely. Maxwell ran a hand through his hair. Nancy could practically see him calculating the cost of his absence from New York. Book me on the next flight back, he said finally. What about the woman you're traveling with? Should I book her a flight too? Maxwell looked at Nancy, his expression tortured. I don't know. Let me call you back. After he hung up, Nancy waited for him to explain, though she'd heard enough to understand the situation. I have to go back to New York, Maxwell said. There are crises that require my personal attention, deals that could fall apart if I'm not there. Nancy nodded, keeping her expression carefully neutral. How long will you be gone? I don't know. Could be a few days, could be a week. These things are unpredictable. And our trip, Maxwell looked away. Maybe we could continue it later, after I get these fires put out. Nancy felt something cold settle in her stomach. This was exactly what she'd feared would happen. Maxwell would remember his real life and realize that chasing her grandparents' love story across the country was a luxury he couldn't afford. Or maybe, she said quietly, this is just reality reasserting itself. Maybe the last week has been a beautiful break from real life, but now it's time to get back to the way things actually are. Nancy, that's not, isn't it? You have responsibilities in New York, important ones. I have a job to get back to in Millport. Maybe we've been living in a fantasy. Maxwell stood up and began pacing their hotel room. It doesn't have to be fantasy. We can figure this out. How? You live in Manhattan and run a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars. I'm a small-town librarian who makes $30,000 a year. Those aren't differences you bridge with good intentions. Money doesn't matter. Money always matters, Maxwell. Maybe not to you because you have enough of it to buy whatever you want. But I can't just drop my life to fit into yours, and I wouldn't ask you to drop yours to fit into mine. Maxwell stopped pacing and looked at her. So, what are you saying? Nancy felt tears threatening but refused to let them fall. I'm saying maybe we should end this while it still feels magical, instead of letting reality turn it into something disappointing. You don't mean that, don't I? Nancy stood up and began gathering her things. Maxwell, you've been wonderful to travel with, and I'll always be grateful that you helped me honor my grandparents' memory, but I think we both know this was always temporary. Maxwell watched her pack with growing desperation. Nancy, please don't do this. Don't let one phone call destroy what we've found. I'm not destroying anything. I'm just accepting what was always true. We live in different worlds, and this trip has been a brief intersection. But intersections don't last forever. Nancy finished packing and turned to face him. I'm going to take a commercial flight back to Maine. You should go handle your business emergency. Thank you for everything, Maxwell. It's been the adventure of a lifetime. She kissed his cheek gently and left the room before he could respond, leaving Maxwell standing alone among the scattered letters that had brought them together and might now drive them apart. Nancy's commercial flight back to Portland was delayed 3 times, giving her plenty of opportunity to question every decision she'd made in the past 24 hours. By the time she finally landed in Maine, it was nearly midnight, and she was exhausted from traveling and crying and trying not to think about Maxwell's expression when she'd walked out of that hotel room. She took a taxi back to Millport, where her small house felt unnaturally quiet after a week of constant conversation and shared discoveries. Nancy unpacked mechanically, trying not to think about the way Maxwell had listened to her, read her grandparents' letters, or the way he'd looked at her when he'd said he was falling in love. The next morning, she returned to work at the library, forcing herself back into the routine that had defined her life before Maxwell Callahan's suitcase had changed everything. Mrs. Patterson came in for her romance novels, the regulars used the computers, and Nancy processed returns and updated the catalog system. But everything felt different now. The life that had seemed perfectly satisfying a week ago now felt small and confined. Nancy found herself staring out the window, thinking about hotel rooms and rental cars and the way Maxwell's hand had felt in hers. You look like someone who's lost something important, Mrs. Patterson observed during her Tuesday visit. Nancy managed a smile, just readjusting to being back home. The trip didn't go as planned. Nancy had told Mrs. Patterson she was taking time off to visit places that had been important to her grandparents, though she'd left out the details about her traveling companion. It went exactly as planned, Nancy said. Maybe that was the problem. 3 days passed. Nancy tried to lose herself in work, but she kept checking her phone for messages that never came. Maxwell was probably relieved that she'd ended things before they got more complicated. He was back in his world of boardrooms and acquisitions, and she was back in hers of overdue books and story time for local children. It was exactly what she'd told him should happen. So why did it feel like she'd made the biggest mistake of her life? On Thursday evening, Nancy was shelving returned books when she heard the front door chime. She looked up to see a familiar figure silhouetted against the evening light. Maxwell Callahan stood in the doorway of the Millport Public Library, looking travel-worn and uncertain, carrying the same black suitcase that had started their journey together. "We never finished the trip," he said simply. Nancy felt her heart skip. "Maxwell, what are you doing here?" "I flew back to New York. I handled the crises. I saved the Singapore deal and satisfied the SEC." Maxwell stepped into the library, looking around at the cozy space where they'd first met. "And then I realized that none of it mattered as much as what I'd walked away from. Your business, Will survive without me for another week. Turns out the world doesn't actually end if Maxwell Callahan isn't personally managing every detail. Maxwell moved closer to her. Well, Nancy, I'm sorry I let that phone call make me forget what was important. I'm sorry I made you feel like you were just a distraction from my real life. Nancy felt tears starting. Maxwell, I'm the one who should apologize. I panicked when reality intruded, and I took it out on you. You were right to panic. I was falling back into old patterns, prioritizing crisis management over the people I care about. Maxwell set down his suitcase and reached for her hands. But I'm here now, and I'm asking you to give us another chance to finish what we started. What about your company, your responsibilities? Maxwell smiled. I hired a very expensive chief operating officer 2 years ago. It's time I let him earn his salary by actually operating the company while I remember how to live. Nancy felt hope blooming in her chest. Are you sure? Nancy, I've spent 5 years building walls around my heart to protect myself from feeling anything. This week with you taught me that those walls weren't protecting me. They were imprisoning me. I don't want to be imprisoned anymore. Nancy stepped into his arms, feeling like she'd come home. I was miserable the moment I left that hotel room. Good. I'd hate to think I was the only one suffering. They held each other in the quiet library, surrounded by thousands of love stories, adding their own to the collection. So where do we go from here? Nancy asked. Maxwell pulled back to look at her. First, we finish your grandparents' journey. We visit the last few stops on their route, including Bar Harbor where they honeymooned. And then we start writing our own love story. One that includes both our worlds instead of forcing us to choose between them. Nancy felt something settle into place in her chest, like a puzzle piece finding its proper spot. What does that look like practically? I don't know yet, but I'm willing to figure it out if you are. Nancy smiled and kissed him softly. I'm willing. Bar Harbor, Maine. In early fall was a study in rugged beauty. Nancy and Maxwell stood on the rocky shore, where her grandparents had honeymooned in 1946 and returned for their 60th anniversary 6 months before James died. The Atlantic Ocean stretched endlessly eastward, and the air carried the salt tang of adventure and possibility. This is where it all began for them, Nancy said, reading from the first letter James had written to Rose from their honeymoon cottage. My dearest wife, I still can't believe I get to call you that. Sitting here watching you read by the window, I'm overwhelmed by the magnitude of what we've promised each other. A lifetime of mornings like this, a lifetime of conversations and discoveries and ordinary miracles. I can't wait to see what we build together. Maxwell looked out at the waves crashing against the granite coastline. And this is where their story ended. No! This is where their story was completed. There's a difference. Nancy pulled out the final letter in her collection, written by Rose to James on their 60th anniversary trip to the same cottage. James, 60 years ago you promised me a lifetime of ordinary miracles, and you've kept that promise every single day. We've been poor and prosperous, young and old, healthy and sick, and through it all we've chosen each other again and again. That's what real love is, not the promise you make once at an altar, but the promise you make new every morning when you wake up and decide to keep loving the person lying next to you. Maxwell felt tears in his eyes. Your grandmother was a poet. She was a woman who understood what mattered. Nancy tucked the letters back into her portfolio. And I think she would have loved seeing us here together. They spent the day exploring Acadia National Park, hiking the same trails her grandparents had walked decades earlier. As evening approached, they found themselves at the cottage where Rose and James had spent both their honeymoon and their final anniversary trip. The current owners, an elderly couple named Frank and Mary, had invited them for dinner after Nancy explained their connection to the cottage's history. "We bought this place 30 years ago," Frank said, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "The previous owners told us about the couple who'd been coming here for decades, said they were the kind of pair that made you believe in true love." Mary nodded. "We've tried to honor their memory by keeping the cottage the way it was when they stayed here. Same furniture, same layout. It feels like their love is still part of this place." After dinner, Nancy and Maxwell walked down to the rocky beach where her grandparents had taken countless sunset strolls. The waves crashed rhythmically against the shore, and the sky blazed with orange and pink. "Nancy," Maxwell said, stopping suddenly, "I have something for you." "What?" Maxwell reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Nancy's heart stopped. "Maxwell, what are you doing?" "Something I should have done 5 years ago with Sarah, but was too busy building an empire to realize what really mattered." Maxwell opened the box to reveal a simple, elegant ring. "Nancy, I know we've only known each other for 2 weeks. I know it's crazy and impractical and completely against every reasonable timeline for relationships. But your grandparents taught me that love doesn't operate on anyone's schedule, but its own." Nancy felt the world tilt around her. "Maxwell, I'm not asking you to marry me tomorrow. I'm asking you to marry me someday, when you're ready. I'm asking you to build a life with me that honors both our worlds instead of requiring us to abandon either one. I'm asking you to write the next 60 years of letters with me." Nancy looked down at the ring, then up at Maxwell's face, which was lit with hope and vulnerability. "Are you proposing to me on the beach where my grandparents honeymooned?" "I'm proposing to you on the beach where your grandparents taught me what real love looks like." Nancy felt tears streaming down her face. "Yes. Yes? Yes, I'll marry you someday. Yes, I'll write letters with you. Yes, I'll build a life that includes both our worlds." Nancy laughed through her tears. "Yes to all of it, Maxwell." Maxwell slipped the ring onto her finger with trembling hands, then pulled her into his arms and kissed her as the sun set over the Atlantic Ocean. Around them, the waves crashed against the rocks with the same rhythm they'd maintained for her grandparents' honeymoon 60 years earlier, as if the ocean itself was blessing their new beginning. 6 months later, Nancy stood in the renovated Millport Public Library, which now occupied a beautiful new building funded by the Callahan Foundation. The original Victorian house had been converted to a community centre, but the library had tripled in size and resources. "The new computer lab is perfect for the digital literacy classes," she told Maxwell as he toured the facility for the first time since the renovation's completion. "Miss, and the expanded children's section means we can host real story times instead of cramming 12 kids into what used to be a storage closet." Maxwell smiled, watching Nancy's excitement as she showed him every corner of her expanded domain. "I'm glad the money was put to good use. It's not about the money, though that's wonderful. It's about what the library represents now. It's still the heart of the community, but now it has the resources to really serve everyone who needs it." Maxwell had established a foundation office in Portland, allowing him to spend half his time in Maine while maintaining his New York business operations. It wasn't a perfect arrangement, but it was working. Nancy had kept her position as head librarian, but now had the budget and staff to implement programs she'd only dreamed about before. They'd been married 3 months earlier in a small ceremony at the same church where her grandparents had been married. Mrs. Patterson had served as Nancy's matron of honor, and Maxwell's best man had been the pilot who'd flown them across the country following the letters. "There's something I want to show you," Nancy said, leading Maxwell to a special display case near the library's front entrance. Inside the case were James and Rose Maeve's love letters, arranged chronologically with small placards explaining the significance of each location they'd visited. The display was titled "A Geography of Love, One Couple's 60-Year Journey." Visitors can follow their story from beginning to end, Nancy explained. And there's a guest book where people can share their own love stories or memories of relationships that have shaped their lives. Maxwell read some of the entries in the guest book, stories of couples who'd been inspired by Rose and James's example to recommit to their own relationships or take chances on new love. Your grandparents are still changing lives, he observed. That's what love does. It echoes forward into the future, touching people who never even met the original lovers. Maxwell put his arm around Nancy and looked at the display of letters that had brought them together. Think we'll have letters like this someday? Nancy smiled. We already do. I've been keeping every email you send, every note you leave on my pillow when you have to leave early for business trips. Our letters just happen to be digital. That's very modern of us. Grandmother Rose would have adapted to email. She understood that the medium doesn't matter, only the commitment to keep communicating, keep sharing your heart with the person you've chosen to love. As they left the library that evening, Nancy noticed a young couple sitting on the bench outside, reading letters to each other from a small stack of envelopes. The woman was crying softly, and the man was holding her hand while she read. Think those are love letters? Maxwell asked quietly. I think love letters come in all forms. Some are written on paper, some are spoken, some are just the decision to show up for someone every day. Nancy looked up at her husband. What matters is that people keep writing them, in whatever form works for their story. Maxwell kissed her temple. Ready to go home and write our next chapter? Nancy smiled. Ready. As they walked toward their car, the sun was setting over Millport Harbor, painting the sky in the same shades of pink and gold that had blessed their engagement on a Maine beach 6 months earlier. Behind them, the library glowed with warm light, full of stories that had already been written and space for all the stories yet to come. Their own story was just beginning, but it was already part of something larger. A continuing tradition of people brave enough to love fully, completely, and forever. Just like Rose and James Maeve had taught them, love wasn't a destination you reached, but a journey you chose to take together. One letter, one day, one ordinary miracle at a time. In the distance, church bells chimed the hour, and Nancy squeezed Maxwell's hand, thinking about all the letters they had yet to write. All the places they had yet to visit, all the years they had yet to share. The future stretched before them like an unwritten love story, and they couldn't wait to see how it would unfold. 10 years later, Nancy Callahan stood in the garden behind their Maine cottage, reading a letter that had arrived that morning from a couple in Oregon. The letter was handwritten on cream-colored stationery, the kind that suggested someone had taken time and care with their words. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Callahan, our names are David and Maria Santos, and we visited the love letter display at the Millport Public Library during our vacation last month. We've been married for 15 years, but somewhere along the way, we stopped really talking to each other. Reading about your grandparents, letters reminded us what we'd lost. We've started writing to each other again, real letters, not just texts about grocery lists and soccer schedules. Yesterday, David left a note in my coffee mug telling me 3 things he loves about who I've become since we met. This morning, I wrote him a letter about the dreams we used to share and asked if he still wants to chase them with me. We wanted to thank you for preserving that story and sharing it with the world. Love really does echo forward, just like the placard in your display says. Maxwell emerged from the cottage, carrying 2 cups of coffee, and found Nancy wiping tears from her eyes. Good letter? He asked, settling beside her on the garden bench they'd installed in the spot where roses bloomed every June. The best kind. Nancy handed him the letter to read. The display has generated over 3,000 pieces of correspondence in the past 5 years. People sharing their own stories, couples recommitting to each other, young people asking for advice about love. Maxwell read the letter, smiling at the familiar cadence of people discovering what Rose and James Maeve had understood instinctively. Your grandmother would be amazed by the reach of her story. I think she'd be more amazed by how many people are willing to do the work of real love once they understand what it looks like. Maxwell set down the letter and looked around their garden. 10 years of marriage had taught them both the difference between the passionate intensity of new love and the deeper satisfaction of chosen love. They'd weathered Maxwell's difficult transition from workaholic to someone who understood the value of being present. They'd navigated Nancy's adjustment to a life that included private jets and charity galas, alongside library book sales and community meetings. Most importantly, they'd learned to write their own love letters, not the romantic declarations of early courtship, but the daily communications that sustained long-term partnership. The notes Maxwell left on Nancy's pillow when business required him to leave early. The emails Nancy sent during his board meetings, sharing small observations about her day. The conversations they had every evening, walking the same route through Millport that her grandparents had taken for 60 years. "I have something for you," Maxwell said, reaching into his jacket pocket. Nancy laughed. "It's not my birthday, and it's not our anniversary." "What's the occasion?" "Do I need an occasion to give my wife a present?" Maxwell handed her an envelope, the expensive kind of stationery he used for important business correspondence. But this was addressed to her in his handwriting, and the return address was their cottage. Nancy opened it carefully and found a single sheet of paper covered with Maxwell's careful script. "My dearest Nancy, today marks 10 years since I found your grandparents' suitcase at the Portland airport. 10 years since you gave me back Sarah's diary and asked for something money couldn't buy. 10 years since you taught me that love isn't about holding on to the past, but about having the courage to build the future with someone who shares your vision of what matters. I've been thinking about the geography of our own love story, the library where we met, the cities we visited following Rose and James's letters, the beach in Bar Harbor where I asked you to marry me, the cottage where we're building our own collection of ordinary miracles. But the real geography of our love isn't measured in miles or marked by monuments. It's measured in the daily choice to keep choosing each other, in coffee shared on garden benches and conversations that last past midnight. In the way you still read to me from letters sent by strangers who've been inspired by your grandparents' story. In the way you've taught me that success isn't about accumulating wealth, but about accumulating moments that matter. Rose Maeve wanted someone to witness what she and James had built together, but I think she also wanted to prove that their kind of love was possible for other people, in other times, under different circumstances. She wanted to show that love letters don't have to be written during wartime to be meaningful. They just have to be written with intention, with commitment, with the understanding that love is both a feeling and a choice. Thank you for choosing me every day for 10 years. Thank you for teaching me that the best love stories aren't about finding your other half, but about becoming whole people who decide to build something beautiful together. All my love, always and in all ways. Maxwell P.S. Check the rose bush by the garden gate. Nancy looked up from the letter to find Maxwell watching her with the same expression of nervous hope he'd worn on the beach in Bar Harbor 10 years earlier. "Maxwell, what did you do?" "Go look by the rose bush." Nancy walked to the garden gate, where the climbing rose they'd planted on their first anniversary was beginning its summer bloom. Tied to one of the branches with a white ribbon was a small metal plaque, the kind used for memorial benches or historical markers. The plaque read, "In memory of Rose and James Maeve, who taught us that love letters never end, they just change form, and in celebration of all the couples brave enough to write their own geography of love, Nancy felt tears starting again. Maxwell, it's perfect. I thought your grandparents deserved a permanent place in our garden, and I thought future visitors should know that this is where their story continues. Nancy turned back to her husband, this man who'd learned to measure success in moments instead of millions, who'd discovered that the most important acquisitions couldn't be bought. Have I told you lately that I love you? Maxwell smiled. Only every day. But I never get tired of hearing it. As they kissed beside the rosebush in their main garden, Nancy thought about all the love letters yet to be written, all the couples yet to discover that real love wasn't about finding someone to complete you, but about finding someone to grow with. Somewhere in Oregon, David and Maria Santos were probably writing notes to each other. Somewhere else, another couple was visiting the library display and learning what Rose and James Maeve had known all along. Love really did echo forward through time, touching lives and changing hearts, and proving that the most important stories weren't the ones that ended with happily ever after, but the ones that showed how ever after was built one choice, one day, one letter at a time. In the distance, the Millport church bells chimed the hour, and Nancy squeezed Maxwell's hand, grateful for another ordinary day in their extraordinary life together. The future stretched ahead of them like an unwritten love letter, and they couldn't wait to see what story they'd tell next. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.